Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 509th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason, and my co-host, Abe Stein. Abe, how you doing?
I am doing so well, Mason. There are no large thunderstorms in my area, and absolutely no dangerous things happening around me at all. It's great.
Yeah, yesterday I actually drove home from an RCQ in like tornado weather, thunderstorm, and hail. Just like the whole way for an hour.
Yeah, would never do that.
Yeah, I'm just built different. But speaking of being built different, this week's episode's going to be built a little different. So, we originally had an episode planned that we were going to do, but it was one that we kind of like was really sort of big with Spencer, and like we kind of needed him, we think, to really give it to you at its fullest. So, instead of trying to like, just kind of do it with us and not have him here, with him being out sick this week, we decided that the best thing to do was just to move that episode and do a different episode. Now, for those of you who don't, aren't the three of us who know how we do episodes, we typically plan things about a month and a half to 2 months in advance, right, Abe? So, with that in mind, whenever we do like kind of an impromptu episode, they sometimes have less planning, less things going on, and we didn't know how Spencer was going to be feeling until, about 30 to 40 minutes before recording here. So with that in mind, we're actually doing a shorter episode this week because we know there's a lot of content out there leading into the RC, and we wanted to do an episode that's a little bit more concise while still helping with the RC. Last week, we talked all about standard. Really quickly, Blue White did really well, and some of the RCs this past weekend. Girk did great. Teamer Analyst did pretty good. There's a lot of things out there, and people will surely be talking about that this week. But we're going to actually talk about open deck lists this week after we do Always Improving, which is the main point of this show. And that's also why your episode might seem to be a little bit shorter, because we are trying to make it more concise so you can get the most content in this week that you can. But Abe, Always Improving is the point of the show. We got to make sure to do it first. What was your Always Improving moment this week?
Yeah, so my always improve moment came from, not forgetting like the process that I've been trying to follow in preparing for the RC this week. As you said, we just had a lot of results over last weekend, and it's really tempting. Like, I've been really tempted, just like, okay, just buckle down, play the same 75, like, start to really get confident with it, really work on things, throw some things in there. But today, I took time away from, like, jamming games and, putting in work in the small scale, and just, like, really dug into the deck lists I could find. Looked at them for inspiration, understood where the format was heading, really looking at other decks' game plans, and coming up with the questions that I want to make sure I can answer before Friday at submission. So, it's really awesome to just feel like that was the natural thing for me to do today, rather than just continue down the same path of jamming, and especially when I've done a lot to, like, add a framework to how I think about what it is I'm doing in preparation for tournaments. Like, having that be something I've stuck to this week is just a really solid one.
Nice. My always improving moment this week actually comes in a little bit of the opposite direction, where, I played an RCQ on Saturday that was about 2.5 hours from my house, sort of some friends, tried to help block for somebody who did end up winning. So when he made the finals and we were like 3 hours away from home when it was 7, I was like, you better win this, And so, congratulations to James on winning that. And then Sunday, we had this local RCQ at my old LGS before I moved, and I wanted to go there and see everybody. And afterwards, I mentioned I drove home in the rain and everything, and I was thinking, I really need to, like, go play standard. Like, I'm doing commentary for the RC. I want to make sure that, like, I understand all the deck and to do this sort of thing. And kind of, like, as I was dreading it, getting to the computer, I was like, what am I doing? I put in other work. There are more days coming. I had to work today because it might be Memorial Day for other people, but what that means, Abe, is that a lot of people have work off, so they want to get coaching, especially before the RC. So, I was like, I'm going to have a little bit of time. I can play on Saturday. I can watch all the things. If you just burn yourself out, you're just not going to want to play in the future days. Just relax. And so I watched two Planet of the Apes movies, Abe, and and just kind of vibed, hung out with my girlfriend a little bit, and called it a day. And it was great. And also, I'll say, Dawn and Rise of the Planet of the Apes, a lot better than I was expecting. It was good.
Ape together strong, Mason.
Yeah, ape together strong. Ape alone weak. And then I cracked the wood. But that was my always improving, was just sort of taking some time and, reminding myself of this thing that, it's very easy for me to just work infinity hours. And it's very easy because I also enjoy the thing I do a lot of the time. But I cannot just be a man who only plays Magic. So
yeah. And do you feel like Ape Together Strong taught you something about the Convoke matchup?
Yeah, it taught me Convoke is nice. It is really nice. I will say this. I did have a weird thought that I thought about making as an always improving moment, Abe, that I think you would really respect for the conversation we had in the pre-show recently of CC, which is that, like, Magic needs more artists and less mathematicians. I don't know if you saw the Jarvis U Twitter poll of, like, do you think you're a Sam Black or a Reed Duke? You know what I mean? And I think that, like, the game has so few Sam Blacks recently, which, like, basically, if you're listening at home, it boils down to, like, are you someone who kind of, like, I mean, the way Jarvis meant it was, like, are you, like, smart but attainable, or, like, your brain works in such a weird way? But I took it as, like, are you someone who, like, thinks outside the box, or someone who masters their craft? And I feel like we just haven't had a lot of people who think outside the box a lot, unless, you look at, Ray and Jason, who obviously are, kind of destroying a lot of Magic conventions and doing really well, right? And relative to Magic's time, they are brand new, but they're obviously been around for a little bit. And I don't know, I was just thinking about how Magic needs some more artists.
Yeah, I think there's something we said. This is something that, like, I think it's a book I mentioned on the podcast like a couple years ago, How to Be a Brilliant Thinker. But they talk about, like, the specifics between divergent and convergent thinking. And I do think, and in general, like, so much of society and culture and everything drives us towards convergent thinking, right? Thinking about something and coming to a finite conclusion, like, and it's much easier to do that. And there's been a lot more demand for that in most settings. That's like a lot. If you can do that efficiently, that is a very, very valuable thing to be able to do. I'm not going to discount the value that is, but thinking divergently, which is like thinking quote unquote outside the box, or thinking about something in a different way, or the ability to, like, look at things from different angles and find different ways to approach something and think of, like, either a broader picture or just a different picture, is like a big skill that people take a long time to learn, because it's not something that's so pushed in education, really, because it's very hard to measure. And so I definitely do think, and I was saying in the pre-show before, that, like, Magic, I think, is at its best, especially culturally, when there are more divergent thinkers who are engaging with the game and, breeding new ideas. And I think that something about, and it might just be also, the COVID era and the Moto era of Magic making it a lot easier to, we've talked about this before, just copy paste Decklist, or, just keep on jamming something or change two things to hone and tweak towards a singular point, rather than, having that's a lot easier of a skill set to get to than necessarily, like, rebuilding something or building a brand new deck from nothing, or uncovering a different way to think about or attack the format. Those are all much more taxing things and more difficult things for a lot of people to do, because it's not a thinking skill that most people get taught, but it's not unattainable. I want to say that too, but it's definitely an interesting way to think about Magic, and also where I think that, a lot of the best players who, like, even in Jarvis's poll, like, I wouldn't say that Reed Duke doesn't have the creativity to come up with new ideas. I think that's actually, like, that'd be a real misnomer to say, like, he's not someone who thinks about the game in a different way than a lot of people do, or has the capacity to do so. I mean, especially early in his career. I don't know how much you know about the rise of Reed Duke, but like, he was doing things that no one else was doing, because that was just kind of how the game was played back then. There was a lot less information available, but now there's more. It's a lot easier to get to success doing things convergently. So
yeah, well, I also think it's, like, it's a little unfair too in some ways, because, like, a lot of what Reed did was like I knew about his history, like you're talking about there, but, like, that formed, like, the way we learned about Magic and the way we think about it, right? Like you're saying, things are so different, but then Reed Duke and people like him come on the scene and sort of, like, teach a new way and do things differently, and so the knowledge evolves and gets based more, like, off him and what he provided to, like, the Magic zeitgeist, right? So it's like, like what you're saying, like, he did have these different things, and I'm sure, like, at the time, a lot of people were talking about Reed the same way we might talk about, Jason right now. So,
oh yeah, I read a lot of articles about, like, acidic slime mortar pod Jund in Standard. I don't know if you remember that deck.
I don't know that deck.
It was this Jund midrange deck from, like, M10 Standard, where he was just like, okay, the plan is against Valakut, we're, like, acidic sliming them, right? And then against the big creature decks, you put the mortar pot on the slime and it has Death Touch, baby. Like, and it was just, like, all this crazy stuff. It was a deck that unlike any other. He was, like, the only person playing, but he did really well in Moto with it, and, like, won some bigger events at the time. And those things I think of in terms of, like, Reed has it in terms of the capacity to do all these things that people attribute to Sam Black or whatever. I just think that, you know, Sam's made a brand for himself in being a really, and I think that's because a lot of his strongest things are just being someone who thinks outside the box, and even to their own claim. I think Sam thinks that too. So.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny. Like, the other thing that reminded me of this, just we'll wrap it up here and go to the main segment, but I've been watching Bleach, and I believe the character is pronounced Mayori, but there's this character, Abe, he has this big speech about perfection, and how, like, he hates perfection, because once you hit perfection, it, like, there's no, like, where else to go, right? And when he was talking about that, I kind of, like, thought about the speech a little bit more later as I was doing something, and I was like, it really reminds me of Magic players, right? Like, when Magic players feel like something is solved, they become lethargic and give up, you know? And, like, obviously his conversation is very different than this, but it just made me think about, like, when formats feel solved, people stop trying, a lot of them do. And then we see, like, you know, really great players and innovators come out and show that there's almost always more things to do, right? Like, there are some situations where it's just like, oh, this is absolutely the best thing, there's nothing else you can do. But we've seen players adapt to things, and it's really interesting just to sort of see, like, who kind of gives up, and kind of like we talked about, like, the MTGO era, right? Like, it's so much easier to copy a deck list. The deck lists are good enough, right? Like, even if maybe they're a card or two off or the people are changing, they're still quite strong, and you can still just succeed. It becomes a lot harder of, like, a cost analysis of your time and everything to put time into these things. And some people, like you said, just don't even have the skills because they haven't been taught. So it's a weird and interesting world we live in right now with Magic. I feel like we're this kind of end of a dark era in a lot of ways, and we're kind of, like, coming back to form, you know what I mean? But I don't know, that's maybe a whole different conversation for a different show.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk endlessly about the Magic community and the direction of Magic as, like, a scene, but let's get to our topic.
Yep. So before that, though, really quickly, we do want to give our shout out to our patrons. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/ccmtg. The show will always be free, but if you enjoyed it and you want to give back, you can do that. And our Patreon page has all the information there. But one of the cool things is there's a Discord where a lot of conversation happens. We've had a lot of conversation recently about, you know, Modern Horizon previews. There's been a lot of talk there. And then we also have, you know, like, a little cheer squad channel. And I just wanted to give a shout out today to someone who actually won their RCQ just a couple hours ago. So congratulations to Nick, won the RCQ about 4 hours ago now, and, you know, those, like, keeping us updated and even, like, putting there, like, hey, I'm thinking about sideboarding like this in matchups. How would you do it? And I wrote up a little bit of how I might do it with the deck list, and so it's really cool and awesome to see all the communication stuff there. And I'm sure that's just going to continue to happen as time moves on. We also want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Heavy Play. You can go to heavyplay.com and use code CCMTG to get 10% off all of your orders. Heavy Play is a luxury deck box, playmat, and card sleeve product. They have lots of things there, lots of demo videos you can check out. Very sleek, very sturdy. Make sure to check out Heavy Play and use our code. That way, they know we sent you. With that all out of the way, Abe, let's get into our main topic, which is open deck lists and playing an open deck list tournament. Because I don't know about you, but this is one of the things that always comes up, especially for someone's first RC, is, what does open deck list mean? Like, should I be doing things differently? And how best should I try to use this information? And we figured this might be a good little episode for y'all today. So, Abe, you know, pretend I'm someone in coaching. I just came to you with those kind of questions. What's, like, your first response?
Yeah, I mean, this is something where I think that I have had personally a lot of success in open deck list settings because a lot of my process is based around, and has historically been based around, like, already having the information coming into the match, or feeling like I do, right? Understanding the possible cards I might be playing against or sideboard plans of my opponents. But really, like, when it comes to open deck lists, most of the time when you see, like, an archetype, like, let's say you're playing against Boros Convoke, you might just already know what your opponent's playing, right? You might already just know, like, okay, it's just going to be there's 4 of all of these cards, and maybe, like, 1 or 2 of these are those. What I think is really important, I mean, even against, like, the Boros Convoke, is to really think about what is going to matter in the matchup to you, right? What are the cards that you're worried about from your opponent's side, and what's different about what your opponent's deck is built like, right? This can be something like, you know, if you're playing against blue-white control, just how many No More Lies are they playing? How many Wandering Emperors are they playing? What's their sweeper count like? and down to like what are their kill conditions, what are their like individual different card choices, and really just flag down and make a note of those and see like what's there and what's missing. I think something that really illustrates that well is just like thinking about, I think domain, or like let's talk about Pioneer. Like Niv to Light, if you know every card in Niv to Light, you can play around that deck a lot better than if you don't, right? You know every Bring to Light possibility, you know everything that can come off of it, you know everything you need to play around. But there's also a lot of variation how people could build that deck. People could tech it in a bunch of different ways, and as soon as that information's out in the open, you have you're not necessarily having an advantage, but you're taking an edge away from them, and them knowing what's in your deck, they take an edge away from you. So any gotcha cards, any plans, or anything in your deck, you want to make sure also still makes sense if your opponent knows about them. So, I don't want to just say it all at once, Mason, but there's a ton to know about open deck lists. But I think that that it's really important to just think about what the edges are that you can avoid giving to your opponent in the way they've built your deck, and the edges that you are no longer able to like get them with on your side of things too.
No, that makes total sense. And you hit on something that I kind of always bring up early in coaching, learning to work on sideboarding, but I bring up around open deck list tournaments as well, which is like get well informed on the deck list that people are playing and what is stock, right? Because that kind of thing in a closed deck list tournament is very powerful, right? In open deck lists, you understand these things, but if you understand why a deck is built the way it is, that gives you a lot of information, not only on what they have, right, but like what battles they're trying to fight. Let's say Abe records a video talking about, why he's playing quick study and blue-white control over deduce. Well, that might give you a lot of information of the kind of games Abe wants to play versus, the more traditional deduce builds, right? And another thing that kind of Abe mentioned that I think is super big that people could just integrate to the practice more is like when you are building a sideboard guide for yourself, try to identify like the 3 cards that you think are the most important in your opponent's deck and the 2 cards that are the most important in your deck that aren't like marquee cards. So for example, Abe, if you and I are looking at Arclight Phoenix or whatever, I'm never going to like let you say Treasure Cruise, right? Like it's true, but it's like the deck always needs that card. Whereas a card like Spell Pierce might be much more impactful, right? So try to look for the things that really matter that kind of are specific to your deck. Don't obviously ignore things like Treasure Cruise, but just don't list them. That's not what the exercise is about. It's about kind of thinking about the matchup more and really getting in your head. And doing that kind of stuff is what Abe is sort of talking about in the open deck list. So when their deck is different, you're able to kind of see those differences. Let's say Abe was playing blue-white control at the RC and he has 2 deduce, 2 quick study. Well, if you're playing against Abe, right, and maybe you're kind of mana screwed and you're just going to want to shove into his mana, then, on turn 2, like, if he's holding stuff up, he might not be able to punish you with the deuce as much, and so the no more lies might be more willing to happen, right? But on turn 3, where normally you maybe want to take a turn off of like casting anything too important because you don't want them to like use a counter on it, and then you want to cast your more important spell on turn 4 when they have like Memory Deluge and double deduce up and Emperor. Now Abe has to punish with quick study. This is just like a random example coming up with the moment here. So that kind of stuff really matters, and thinking about like the implications of those things will get a long way. So a lot of the open deck list stuff you should kind of pre-prepare and think about what's different. And that's before you even get to sideboarding, which is the biggest thing. But Abe, before I talk about a very specific question I hear a lot on social media and stuff, I'm kind of curious, is there anything you wanted to say about what I had to say there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like one more thing just to think about when it comes to open deck list is that it also means, and this is something that has come up for me in San Diego last year, especially for the standard RC, I was pretty hesitant to play like red-black mid-range, so I wound up playing through the event and feeling really good about that tech choice. But I was hesitant to play it coming into that event because when I played online and would play against Esper Legends, which was like the other most popular deck, I felt like I was constantly having to board in ways that like would leave me like, okay, I'm covering Wedding Announcement, but if they don't draw it or don't have it, then like maybe these Duresses I brought in aren't good, or these Vampire's Vengeances I brought in aren't good, but like I need them here if they have it, but if they don't, then I don't. And so I had to really go back and change how I was testing that matchup to say, as I would during the tournament, right, okay, I know my opponent has this number of this card in their deck. How will I board knowing that this is a problem, right? Once you get past just identifying what could happen to you, thinking about what can't happen to you, or what is their game plan going to look like based on how you can see clearly how they're going to construct their deck. And that can mean also that when you're play testing for an open decklist tournament, especially with decks that, I mean, right now Esper midrange is still fundamentally a lot of the same deck as that Esper Legends deck, and it still has a lot of the same squeezes where, like, it could play main deck Wedding Announcements, it could play, you know, Wandering Emperors, it could play Nut. Like, there's a lot of different things it could play, and it's important to know what those are. And if you know what those are coming into the game you're about to play, it helps you not have to necessarily overvalue or undervalue different cards, right? Like, if you know they have Wedding Announcement, maybe you want to keep a hand that has, and maybe Molding the Six, maybe you want to hold on to that sweeper that's not usually that effective, right? If you have a main deck, you know, small ball sweeper, like Temporary Lockdown in your play control deck, maybe you want to have that because it's just a little bit better against more of their draws than if they didn't. And, you know, you're just going to have that against a Rafine and, you know, and a 4-drop. Like, that just wouldn't make sense to do. In the same way, it works on the other end, too, that you can know that they don't have that Wedding Announcement, so you don't need that card. And just things like that, they really do add up. And, like, there's a lot of times I'll play against people, and my friends will play against people, we'll talk about it afterwards, and they'll say, like, I don't know that my opponent really took to heart or read my deck list at all. They, like, looked at it and saw the archetype, and that was it. And so even if you're doing more than that and just trying to work with the information you have, it can change the way that you're prepared for the match you play or for the tournament you're playing. Just to know that going in when you're making those decisions.
Yep, I like that a lot. Abe, before we move on to this next point here, I have a question to ask you that I've been thinking a lot about recently when it comes to this is, would you say that you play, like, when you normally play a Magic tournament, you're playing like a 95% open deck list already, but even if your opponent isn't?
Yeah, I would say that a majority of the matches I play, my opponent would really have to be, like, doing something very unconventional for me to not be familiar with what's going on.
I say this simply to say that, like, when we are practicing for, like, the RC or for any tournament, understanding other decks is a really important and good use of time. If you have, like, a solid, good understanding of your deck, yes, maybe playing a league is more fun than watching some breakdown videos on, like, 5 or 10 decks and getting a better understanding of ones you don't understand. But just understanding more will help you more. And so, you know, just, I think it's going to help a lot with the open deck lists with a couple days before the RC. Trying to jam those last couple of games probably does not matter nearly as much as just learning more about Gurk if you don't understand the deck.
Yeah, I think I remember the biggest example of, like, and this is in the era before open deck lists. This is something that Jonathan Sukenik told me about a match he played at an invitational once. Mm-hmm. And it was during, like, green-black Delirium Standard, where Emrakul was still legal, and he would read, like, every deck list by every pro in every article before he'd have a clipboard with all these deck lists and, like, really take time to study them and understand what was going on. I took a lot of inspiration from him in that. But he played against someone who, based on, like, I think it was something like they played it was either a certain land, like maybe like a game trail or something, or just, like, it was something where they played a different land, and he immediately knew, based on the fact that they played this land in game one, in their deck at all, what exact build it was likely that they were playing of the deck, how they would sideboard if they were following that, like, that content creator sideboard. I think it was like a Brad Nelson list or something. It was like if they were playing one Aether Hub or whatever it is, I'm making this up at this point, but we're playing this one land, then it had to be this person's deck list, and this player's, right, the person who published that deck list, they board like this in the matchup, so I know that I should be boarding like that, because that's how it's going to beat the way that they're approaching the matchup. And he, like, 2-0'd the guy. And I was like, that is the craziest story I've ever heard. But it all was true. Like, at the end of it, the person was playing, like, talking about first, like, he was playing that deck list, and he did know it because he did see that land, and he had done his homework. And, like, open deck lists, you just start with that, right? Like, you start knowing all of that without having to see them do that. And you can read into that by just looking at the deck list and understanding it. So it really is, like, a lot of matches I play at this point, I'm not that open. I'm not Rain Man like Jonathan was in his heyday. But I do feel like most of the time, I mean, even against, like, decks like Amalia, which have a lot of different options they could be Court of Calling for, what they could collect a company into, I can pretty easily suss out, based on, you know, the beginning of things, what, like, their possible range of their chord targets are, or their, you know, what their 1-ofs or 2-ofs could be, based on maybe how they're even trying to play the game, or how I should play the game if it's that. So,
yep, yeah,
most definitely.
Try not to be surprised is a good takeaway from this episode, I think. Speaking of try not to be surprised, Abe, one of the things that people talk the most about is maybe playing a one of as order to maybe not surprise your opponent in an open deck list tournament, but make them think more about it. So a classic example is like maybe I play one Spell Pierce. What do you think about kind of adding something like that to your deck in a holistic way? Obviously, there are situations, right, where your deck might already do that agnostically. But what do you think about in like the context of like, ooh, I'm going to play this one spicier card that they have to think about?
I've got two answers to this. One is, like I said in the beginning of this topic, it's really important to think about the edges that you're giving up as well. So how good is that first copy of Spell Pierce if your opponent, when it really, really matters, knows to play around Spell Pierce? Like, if you're going to lose all gotcha factor of they didn't know I'd have Spell Pierce and I got them because I left open a blue mana and I did it. Versus, like, them on... Maybe they have the game pretty locked up at turn 6, and then they wait till turn 7 to play another land before casting the, like, you know, whatever spell it is that's going to beat you. Because they know that you might have Spell Pierce, right? That card is going to be that much worse. And odds are, unless it's a card that, like, really makes sense to play in your deck, you're probably making your deck... Like, if you draw the Spell Pierce in spots where it's bad, is the fact that your opponent might have spent energy thinking about Spell Pierce, like, did that matter? As much as drawing a card that was not good in your deck, or as good as the card maybe it would be. So I think it's important to think about that. I also think the part two of that is, if you're going to do something like that, you have to commit to the bit. Like, you have to be not just putting that card in your deck to make them think about it. You have to be playing to make them think about it. Like, there's something that's happened to me on Magic Online before. I don't know if you've experienced this, Mason, but like sometimes in Modern or in Pioneer, you just get like the Hallowed Fountain Shock on turn 1 out of blue-white, and you just know there's a Spell Pierce in their hand. Like, if you're not willing to play in a way that you're going to do something like that to leverage having a Spell Pierce in your hand, even if you don't, like, unless we're talking about playing at that level in terms of using the information, and also your opponent's even thinking about it and not even just jamming right into you, then you're probably not getting the most you could out of just building your deck that way versus the quote-unquote better way to do it. So I'm pretty against it, and I think a lot of people do it. I think there's value to playing a broad range of answers and a mix of these things, especially in open deck lists, so that you have your things covered and so that you can know if you need to worry about the flexibility of your cards or not. Like, if I have an Abrade or a Fires of Victory and I'm playing Teamer at both my deck, and like I'm playing its green black like mid-range in the dark, I might think maybe, okay, some of these decks do play Unlicensed Hearse, I probably should hold on to this Abrade, but if I know that they don't have it, then I can use the Abrade and then save the Fire's Victory to kick it later for more value. Like, these are all things that can come up that don't undo the value of having a flexible card, or maybe don't make your opponent think about the fact you have a flexible card, but, you know, do matter.
Yeah, I think it matters a lot on like what your deck can facilitate, and also the card that it's going to be replacing. One thing that sometimes drives me crazy, Abe, is when someone says, oh, it's free or whatever, right? So this happens a lot in Pioneer Phoenix, where it's like, you know, oh, like, I play in these 12 cantrips or whatever, right? Like, there's just a free card. I just move through it. And it's like, no, like, that. Let's get past the part where it costs mana. There's the opportunity cost of another card being played there, right? And in that deck, you often want to have these, like, high number of cantrips. But, you know, sometimes, Abe, when I'm sideboarding in a lot of cards and I'm pivoting away from, like, my Treasure Cruise graveyard plan, I will trim something like an Opt because I want to go up on raw card quality. The opportunity cost of another card has been taken, right? So when you choose to play your Spell Pierce, or whatever your one of fun of is in the situation, right? Or maybe, you know, sometimes the second copy of something to make them respect it more. It is taking the place of another card. Now, I think diversifying sometimes can be really strong. Like you talked about there with Fires of Victory and Abrade, right? That sort of thing can be big. But I think it's important to do it with intent and make sure it's something that actually makes sense to do and is not some like leveling, very cute factor. If, you know, Spell Pierce is a very strong and reasonable card and your deck to, you know, normally play and you're close on it, you know, having maybe a split of it and let's, you know, say some other card in that space, that seems fine. You know what I mean? Like that's understandable. Is your deck trying to lean into that? That is the other part, is will your opponent be able to actually respect what you're doing, right? And will, you know, you get the maximum blowout potential? I think a good example of this, I think, is like in the festivities and like the Convoke Mirror, where the decks are, you know, they have some amount of like smoothing, but not as much as other decks do. So in the festivities, if you have a bunch of them in your sideboard, sometimes they make your draw really clunky, and your opponent can't really play around them, right? If they know they have four, then and you're not playing to the board, they maybe could do something. But if you have one or two, right, and you're playing like the mirror or toxic or something, you're probably just going to shove into it, and that's also kind of what you want to do anyways, and that gives us in the festivities the highest blowout potential, right? If this card kind of stops them when they're doing the thing they want to do, and you just kind of get to have it, and it's not a huge cost to you, that can be really big. But if you give your opponent a lot of agency in the decision, which we all know the Phoenix deck does, but like jokes aside, like if you get a lot of agency in the choice, sometimes it might come back to bite you, right? Might also help you, like Gabe said before. If I outthink myself and I'm like, oh, I can beat everything if I just play on the Spell Pierce, and you don't think about a combination of cards that could beat you, right? Then you might lose a game that you would have won had you just jammed into the Spell Pierce. So I think it's really the big takeaway is just do it with intent and do it with purpose, and think about how the games are going to play. How are they going to want to interact with us, right? If I see one in the festivities from my opponent, and I'm a deck that puts a bunch of 1/1s in play, and my hand is weak to it either way, I'm probably going to jam harder into that card to try to shorten the game so that you don't get it. Which means your one of copy, if you draw it, it would probably be a lot more impactful than if you played four. And I might take a slightly slower approach because you've got so many. Maybe you mulliganed, right? You're not having the fastest start, maybe because you mulliganed, maybe because you're in the festivities. So just think about how the games will play. And I think that will help you a lot going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that something you just said, like splitting the numbers on those things, even for like for hate especially, can be really valuable. Something I did in Denver playing Rhinos was like, I actually think I'm going to talk to you about it, Mason, where I was like thinking about how Blood Moon didn't even seem that good that weekend. And especially, and like, I could have played Blood Moon, I could play Mags the Moon. Both were like fine, but they weren't even necessarily feeling worth the slots because most of the decks that they were good against, except with the exception of Amulet, it didn't seem to matter which one you had, or like it didn't matter enough for the slots. But in those matchups, if they didn't know that I had Blood Moon and they just kept their deck really streamlined, that would be really, really threatening. So I settled on just playing a Blood Moon and a Magus of the Moon because they were fine. They were still effective, but and like in a closed decklist tournament, I might have not played them at all because I know that they would have boarded in the answers to them. But if they knew I was the madman not playing Blood Moon, then suddenly I'm not a madman at all. I'm an idiot. So so they just smoke with Amulet, right? Or Tron or whatever it is. But by having both, I'm actually right. It put the question on them to, okay, which one am I going to have when I do have it? And you need to have answers to both, and this will cause you to dilute your deck. So it's another way you can think about the information you're giving your opponent about your deck, and especially in like hate pieces and sideboard of how can I make my opponent have to respect a lot of things, and what makes them have to respect. Now, a card like Spell Pierce isn't something you necessarily have to respect so much because it is inherently kind of a card that serves a purpose of making them stop, or like I'm going to get them on a good tempo turn, right? That's not the right kind of card to really see this effect with. But something like something like Blood Moon, or even in Standard right now, it could be maybe you do want to play some number of Rest in Peace if you're worried about your teamer matchup. Not even necessarily because you think Rest in Peace is going to be the card you need to draw in the teamer matchup, but because it puts additional pressure on your teamer opponent to decide whether or not they want to respect the Rest in Peace should you draw it, because obviously it will be good against them if you do. But right, it puts that element into play. And so, thinking about not only how your deck is going to be built and functioning and what cards you think are good, but what makes it difficult for your opponent to answer, or what diversifies in a way that can make your opponent kind of have to respect a lot of things or put pressure on them to have a wide range of answers, can be really valuable. I think in this standard form, it's kind of unique for that to be the case because things are so powerful that typically it hasn't been the case in Standard. I would only really talk about this in like Modern or Pioneer, where the hate can be really strong. But I think in this format right now, there are spots, especially around like the Teamer deck or Slogurk deck, where that kind of thing can come up.
Mm-hmm. Abe, is there anything else you want to say about this topic before we wrap it up?
The only thing I really want to say is that the worst thing you can do is think too hard about it. The best thing you can do is think about it. So, like, do take the time if you're playing the RC this weekend in America and your opponent right past you the decklist, you have those 2 minutes. Spend that 2 minutes thinking about the match you're about to play, looking at the cards they have. Hell, even take some mental notes of like, okay, they have no main deck counter magic that's 2 mana outside of No More Lies. So that means that I'm free to, if I have 3 mana up, I can just cast my thing into that. Or, maybe they have no removal that doesn't get lost. So, that can change things too. Or, right, they have no lockdown. So they have many lockdowns, right? Like, just think about what your opponent's deck has, what the important cards are, the same way that you would when you're sideboarding, but before you start playing. And if there's anything weird, take mental note of it so that you can keep track of, okay, like they're going to have one good answer to this. I need to make sure that I'm playing around it. Or maybe they have no good answer to this. And so my hands that have that, I should prioritize, right? This game plan of mine is going to be the strongest one I have available to me because of the way their deck is built.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's beyond you in this moment, that's fine. Just don't sit there and like blank stare drool at the deck list. Give yourself some time to think about how you're going to use that information because it is available to both players to use. So, start thinking about what could happen in the game, or even afterwards, ask your opponent, like, given what you saw in the deck list, what did you think? Right? There's a lot to learn from how your opponent's thinking about the deck and about their deck, about the matchup, about everything that you already have access to. If you could really read the tea leaves, and your opponent will probably explain it to you if you ask him. So,
yep. Yeah, this week's episode of Constructive Criticism, our advice. Think some.
Yeah, use your brain, kids. I promise. It's a good thing to do.
It's funny from like, I didn't even plan it when I was talking about like the perfection, like deck building thing, right? With like thinking of artists or whatever. But like, there's a lot of this episode that's just like, I don't know, like push yourself outside your boundaries a little bit. Think about what things are like, what's going on. What can you do about that? That is kind of the whole takeaway from the episode that wasn't really intentional with the first part there. So it's interesting. Anyways, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Constructive Criticism. If you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/ccmtg. One of the other benefits is we do a Patreon bonus episode every month, and we're kind of restructuring those into kind of what we would play and why with what's going on with the RCQ season /RCs. So this week's is going to be up. We've recorded it. It's ready to go. It just needs to get posted. So we're going to have that ready to go, so you can check that out by being a patron of $5 or more. And, of course, you can find the podcast on Twitter at ccmtg. You can find us on YouTube as well with Constructive Criticism. And you can find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. If you want to reach out for coaching, you can do that there or via my Gmail, masoneclark@gmail.com. You can find me each and every other week on TCG Player writing an article about something in Magic. This last week I talked about some of the more exciting cards from MH3 and talked a little bit about what I've done with them in the past. And so if you want to check out that, you can check it out on TCG Player right now for free. It is not a paid walled article. And if you want to watch me on Twitch, I'm streaming a bit more. Go to twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. Abe, on June 7th, I get to be part of this MTGO Early Access streamer event for Modern Horizons 3. So we're going to have kind of a queue where we're going to be able to play decks and do stuff, and it's going to be really cool. And I'm really excited. So if people want to watch that, they can check me. And I'm sure many of your favorite content creators will be live all day that day playing MH3 a couple days before it hits MTGO officially. So make sure to check that out. And Abe, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
They can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. And I do plan on having availability for coaching, likely booking for the middle of June at this point. I have a couple of people reaching out, so that those spots are filling up quickly. Additionally, you can find me on June 7th in the like Squidward looking out the window at SpongeBob meme while I watch Mason play with all the MH3 cards with all the other content creators, and I'm out here like, just taking it with everyone else.
Yeah, Abe, the real question is, and we'll figure it out the day of, do I go in as if this is, day one from when I last left with MH2, and trying to optimize decks, or do I go in with, like, here are some of the fun decks I found? And that's the thing, I'm internally struggling with, I could be like...
I would say this is something you gotta take from fighting games, and I'm sad Spencer's not here to reinforce
that. Fighting games and Spencer's gone. Let the record show as well. We also
I would say to the haters out there, it's not just Spencer. Fighting games are really good teaching tools. They have a lot of good fundamentals in them. Anyway, All I gotta say is, if you miss the chance to okie doke them at level 0, what are you doing? Like you're losing out on so much free ground. You're gonna teach them too much too quick.
Yeah,
You gotta get your hits in before they learn to block. Then once they start blocking, you start grabbing. Mason, come on.
that's true. That's true. All right. Well, it'll be fun. It'll be a fun time. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week for, I think, our pick 2 set review of MH3. So see you all then.